Hello, everyone. Welcome to Introduction to Computational Arts, or ICA for short. In this course, we're going to introduce you to a programming language, specifically JavaScript, and we're going to be using a platform called p5.js to help us do that. It's going to be an introductory course, which means no prior experience is required. We're going to take things step by step, and we're going to go through all the different building blocks that make up a programming language using p5.js. So let's get started. So I'm looking at the p5.js website now. All the links will be in the description below, including the examples we're going to be developing throughout the course. So every week I'll be posting videos like this one, taking us through all the different elements of the programming language. This week we're going to really take our first steps. In this video in particular, we're going to write our first program, go through the p5.js editor, which we're going to be using throughout the semester. And in the next video this week, we're also going to start talking about drawing basic shapes and colors. So really basic concepts about the syntax of the language. And we're going to build on that as we go each week. So p5.js, it's a free open source project that is part of the Processing Foundation. And it is basically this environment where you can learn how to program within this kind of sandbox that makes it very easy to get started and gives you access to tools right away where you can start to make things happen visually in the browser. You can create interaction, and it makes learning programming a lot more fun. So we'll go over different sections of this website in future videos, but for now we're going to focus on the p5.js editor, which is over here. Now you can download p5.js as a file, and there's other ways that you can write p5.js sketches or programs. We'll talk about those different approaches later in the semester, including using things like Visual Studio Code to write programs offline and so forth. But just for now, we're going to focus on using the editor that is included with p5.js, and the link is over here. Now, this editor is very useful for beginners because it just gives us really quickly a place where we can start to write some code. We'll be able to see the result of this code in this section of the window over here. And we're going to have access to this handy console down here, which is going to be where we can see our errors. And also, we can also output some text to that console to help us figure out what's happening in our code. So before we write our first program, which is the goal of this video, we're going to take a quick tour of the editor just to look at some of the basic, most important features. So first off, the first thing you should do is you should go ahead and create an account on the p5.js website. You'll be able to do this over here. Once you sign in, you'll be able to save your sketches. You'll be able to build a repository of sketches, right? So you'll be able to save those. Which is really important if you want to be able to save your work and submit it. So first thing to do is create an account on p5.js. There are some basic settings for the editor over here. You can see I'm using the dark theme because I prefer it. There's a few different options here. You can change the text size, autosave, and so forth. So I would just leave the defaults. Otherwise, pick whatever color scheme you prefer. And then beyond that, this is a very simple editor. Over here is where we're going to enter the code for our program. This pane over here gives us the line numbers. And this is where you can specify a name for your sketch. So this is the first thing I'm going to do right now, is make sure I give the sketch a name. When you create a new sketch or program in p5.js, it just will generate a random name. But let's come up with something here a little bit more descriptive. We're going to give this program a name. Okay? So that's the first thing to do. And then you should probably go ahead and save it right away, just to make sure it's been saved. Unless you save that program, see now it's been added to my sketches. It will add my name, my username afterwards. Unless you save the program, even if you rename it, once you leave the browser web page, your work will be lost. So the first thing you want to do is save your work, give it a meaningful name, and then you can kind of dive in and get started. So this area here is where the code goes. This will be the result of our code, and we can see what happens when we run the code by hitting the play button. Okay? So if you hit play, it's going to run this program. We will see the output in the preview window. We can stop it using the stop button. And there is this little checkbox here, which I have checked right now, yours may not be. Auto refresh means that as we make changes to the code, and we'll see that in a minute once we write our first program, the preview is going to update automatically. So it's going to continuously be refreshing what you put into here. Whereas if you leave that unchecked, you have to stop and start your program to see the changes that you're making. So we'll come back to that in a second once we have some code that we've written. All right, let's continue our tour of the editor here. So there's a little arrow box here that you can click. And if this was not open by default, this is going to open up the sketch files pane. And for the first few sketches that we write, we're not going to really need to worry about this part too much. But in this video, we're going to talk about just take a quick peek as what's underneath, what's behind the scenes here in these sketch files. And down the road, when we write sketches that require asset files like images or our final project, we're going to start to dive a little bit more into these files here. But for now, it's worth mentioning really what is a P5.js sketch and where does it live? How does it exist in the browser and in what context? So we have three files when we create a sketch on the P5.js editor. We have sketch.js, which is the file we're currently editing here. This is basically our program. We have a style sheet. Now, if you've done any HTML and CSS, you might recognize these. This is a style sheet you can edit, and it will essentially just change with the HTML on this side of the page over here. So P5.js sketches being written in JavaScript, they're simply embedded inside a regular web page. This is what makes P5.js a great starting place as to learn how to program, is that everything you make in P5 can live on the web as a website. Makes it very easy to share your work, to send it to others, to keep it available, to make it available as part of your portfolios for people to view. So this is very convenient for that. So we have a style sheet here should you want to change the way the HTML is being styled over here. Most likely we're not going to mess with this, but this is kind of the default. It just gets rid of the margins, and it kind of assumes the main thing we're going to have on our web page is going to be this HTML canvas element, which we're going to be drawing into using P5. And then finally, we have an index page here. This index.html is what actually contains our web page. And this is where all the kind of important linking is being done. So we can see here, if you haven't done HTML before, don't worry about this. We're not really going to, that's not going to be our focus in this course. We're not going to dive into HTML at all. But I just want to show you what happens when we create a P5.js sketch. So HTML is a markup language, which means we have these different tags here. And in any basic web page, you will always have a HTML tag. You will have a head tag, which is kind of setting up some initial conditions for the page. And then we'll have the body, which is the actual content of the web page. And we can see some here. So I've added some text. Of course, it's on a dark background, so we can't really see it well. But this is just HTML. And by default, our page doesn't really have anything in it. The P5.js library will create the canvas object for us. All that happens automatically behind the scenes. But we can see that we're including a few JavaScript libraries from the get-go. So this link over here brings in the P5.js library, the current version, which at the time of filming this is 1.4.0. It is linking to it dynamically, which means every time you run your program, this is downloading P5 from this website, which is hosting it. So this is a very convenient way to link to a JavaScript library, making sure you always have the latest version. It will pull from dynamically from this website and just include it as the first step when this web page loads. By default, P5 also includes the sound library, so it's always there if you want to start using it. We're going to dive into sound way later in this course when we start talking about our game that we're going to build. You can see here it's linking to this style sheet, which we just looked at. And then there's not too much else going on. In the body, it is simply including whatever we write into sketch.js. So behind the scenes, what we have is a very simple HTML page that is embedding the P5.js library, the sound library, and then our sketch.js file, which we're going to dive back into over here. All right, there it is. So behind the scenes, when we write P5, just remember you're writing JavaScript and you're basically creating a web page that contains a JavaScript, an HTML canvas element that you're going to be drawing into using P5. Okay. All right, so I'm going to close this parenthesis here on HTML. I think it's worth just understanding a little bit how this fits in terms of the bigger ecosystem of things. All right. So let's just dive in. We're going to write our first program in this video. We're going to go kind of skip over explaining some concepts. And then in the next video we're going to take a step back and really unpack all of the syntax a lot more carefully. But for now, let's just make something happen here in our preview window. So we can see at a glance, we have these two functions. We have a function called setup. We have a function called draw. And we can see that they're enclosed using these curly bracket characters. And if I select one over here, the matching one closes it here. We'll talk more about this in the next video as well. But when we write JavaScript or P5, blocks of code or sections of code are always going to be delimited by these curly bracket characters. So we have our setup. Setup is basically something that's going to run once when the program first starts. So think of it as like the initialization. It's going to go through whatever instructions we put in setup once, and then never going to revisit setup again until you reload the page. Okay? Whereas draw acts as our main loop for the program. Sometimes you have programs that like scripts that will just go through the instructions in the program one at a time, right? Because a program really is kind of like a recipe. It's a series of instructions you're giving the computer. Please do this, then do that, then do this, then do that, right? And it will simply go through the list and then end. This would be like a command line script, for example. And there's many of these types of programs out there. When we're writing a program in P5, we're creating an interactive environment, which means beyond the setup stage, which it's going to run through once, there's going to be the concept of a loop. There's going to be this bit of code that's going to repeat over and over, that's going to draw things, that's going to wait for the user to interact with the window, and that's going to respond to what we do. So all of that stuff is going to happen inside this draw section over here. Okay. All right, so what can we do in draw? Well, we can draw stuff amongst other things in P5. For example, we could get a circle to appear, and let's put that circle at 200 and 200. That's a coordinate, and let's make it 100 pixels wide. There's our first circle. Okay? And because P5 is interactive, right? This can change over time. If we wanted to add interaction to this program, we could make the circle follow our mouse cursor, for instance. So instead of drawing it at a fixed coordinate here, we're going to tell it actually use the mouse coordinates, mouse X and mouse Y, as your position. And now the circle's following my mouse. Like I said, I'm going over some of these ideas quickly in this first video, and we'll unpack some of this in the second one. What we're trying to do here is just write our first program and make something interesting happen. So now we have a circle following our mouse cursor. We could change the size of this canvas over here. So by default, the editor in P5 will always make a canvas that is 400 pixels wide by 400 pixels tall. I prefer to just have this canvas fill the entire space available. So the way that we can do this is by using what's called a built-in variable. We'll talk about this more in the next video, but for now, let's replace these with window width and window height. And we can see that our sketch now, our sandbox has all of a sudden gotten a little bit bigger. Okay? So very cool. Now, other things we can do, like you can see here, one of the things that's happening with draw is that we start with this background, okay? And we're giving it a number here. We'll explain those later on, but this is basically a gray level color. If I put a 0, it would be black. If I put 255, it would be white. And we can also put color names in there if we want. Okay? So pretty neat. And when we call background, what we're doing is we're creating an animation by essentially erasing the background with a solid color and then drawing this circle in a different place based on where the mouse is. So we can move these instructions to different places in our program and get wildly different results. For example, I could move this background from the draw function into the setup function. And what's going to happen is because setup only runs once, right? It's going to clear the background once in the beginning and then never do it again for the duration of the program. So now we get a very different thing happening here. Right? Whereas before, we would clear the background at the beginning of every frame. Now we only do it once in setup, and we get very different results. And that really highlights the difference between setup and draw, right? Setup runs once in the beginning, and then once we go into draw, this is a repetitive thing. It just keeps repeating draw over and over, running the code that we placed in here. Right. And just for fun, let's add a little bit of spice to this program. We're going to make it respond to what our mouse is doing, not just the position, but also my mouse button. We're going to check if I'm pressing the mouse, I'm going to change the color of the circle. Maybe I'll change it to like orange or something. And then if I'm not pressing the mouse, it's going to be white. We're going to do that by asking a question. We're going to say if mouse is pressed, if the mouse is pressed, then we're going to set an orange fill and a black stroke. Okay? And if it isn't, right? If the mouse is not pressed, else we're going to set a white fill and a black stroke. Again, actually, let's do a white stroke for the orange scenario. And all of these will dive into much more detail in future videos. This is just so we write an interesting first program. And you'll notice I'm using, again, the curly brackets here to define new sections of code. So now I've made my program interactive as well, so you can't see my hand, but when I'm pressing my mouse cursor, I'm now changing the color of my circle. Pretty neat. All right. And there it is. This is our first P5.js sketch. It's an interactive program that lives on the web. And as I mentioned, we went over a lot of these ideas very, very quickly. Now what we're going to do in subsequent videos is go back a few steps and unpack all of this syntax, right? All of the rules I'm following when I'm writing lines of code. We're going to explain that in great detail. But before we do, I also want to take just a few minutes to go over a couple of other areas of the editor that are worth pointing out. Okay? So first, I want to talk about the console over here. We haven't seen anything yet, but odds are, as you write your programs, you're probably going to make some mistakes. Okay? For example, I might write circle like so, and circle actually expects 3 parameters: a coordinate and a size. So this is an error, right? I made a mistake writing my code, and the console here is now reporting a problem. So this is saying P5.js says a circle was expecting at least 3 arguments, 3 parameters, but only got 2, right? And it's telling me where that error is happening. So it's saying on line 17. So over here we have the line numbers. These are very, very handy for navigating your program, and especially if you're asking questions about your code online, getting somebody else to help you. We're going to use line numbers to point to specific lines in your code very quickly. So it's saying on line 17, right, something is awry here. So the console will always be giving you some clues as to what is going wrong with your code. And your job as a programmer is going to be to learn to interpret those clues and and then fix the problem, right? So it's going to become a bit of a game of trial and error sometimes, some detective work, but the more you program, the better you will get at it. Let's introduce another error. Okay, the errors are pretty good in P5. They're not always going to be exact, but this is usually a good starting point. Okay? So here it's giving me this new error. It's saying mouse is pressed is not defined. So that means P5 doesn't know what I'm talking about when I say mouse is pressed. This is not part of the language. It's not something that's been defined in the program. And it even gives me a useful suggestion here saying, oh, maybe by accident you wrote mouse is pressed instead of mouse is pressed. Okay, so this is one of the really cool things about P5 is they've done a lot of work to not only identify the errors, but give you some helpful suggestions that as a beginner will help you troubleshoot where you went wrong in your program and correct the mistakes. Until you get rid of all the mistakes in your code, unfortunately, you will be faced with empty programs. So that is the most frustrating thing when you're learning how to program is you will undoubtedly make a lot of mistakes, and it becomes a game of finding them all, fixing them all until your code can run. Okay? And until your console is clear over here, you probably have some mistakes left that you need to take care of. All right. So the console, we're going to have other uses for the console down the road, like printing our own information to it. But for now, this is where you're going to have access to your errors, your error reporting, so that you can fix your code. Over here, we have the line numbers, very helpful because we're going to refer to the line numbers given to us in the console to find, where the errors are in our program. So another very useful thing. And then finally, another nice feature of the editor. So we have these menus here. I haven't really talked about them too much, but they're pretty straightforward. You can search and replace in the code. We have this feature here called tidy code, which is kind of nice. So you'll notice when I wrote this program, I followed a particular indentation pattern with my code. This is something we'll kind of encourage you to do, and we'll explain down the road as we go a little bit better. But every block of code tends to be indented from the next, just so we can understand the flow of the program a little bit better. Of course, the code will still run even if it's not formatted in that way when it comes to the white space, right? So some of the syntax elements are crucial, like the parentheses and the curly brackets, but the spacing, how you choose to format your code, this is not critical for the code to run. This just helps you read the program a little bit better and parse it easier. So this still runs, right? But it looks like a mess now. So if you don't want to obsessively maintain the correct indentation at all times, what you can do is just hit the tidy code button over here, and magically P5.js or its editor will automatically format your code to make it look good. So this is a good feature to know about, especially in the beginning. You don't have to worry too much about formatting. You can just write the code, and then once in a while, just tidy it up here with this button. So very, very useful, because the cleaner your code is, the easier it will be for you to read it and to find problems in it and so forth. So learning how to code is already difficult enough. You don't need to add extra challenges by writing messy code. Right. And then one last thing before we move on to the next video, I'm going to save my program over here. The last thing I want to highlight is how to share programs. So if you click on the share button here, once you've saved the program on P5, it's going to give you a few options for you to share it. Embed, it gives you a frame that you can include if you paste that into some other HTML you're building. We're not going to worry about this one too much, but we have two options here. We have the edit link. So this is what you're going to share. Let's say you're on our Discord server and you want to get some help. You're going to share this link. Hey, I'm writing this program and I'm having some issues. This is going to take us directly to this page, right, where we can see your code and the preview window. When you submit your assignments, you're also going to use this edit link so we can see both your code and the result. This full screen link over here just gives you another URL where essentially if you want to present your work, or maybe you would just want to show it to someone and not have the code appear, you just want to see it in full screen and its full glory, you would use this URL instead. And you can always link back to the edit version from that link also. So sharing your code is just these two URLs that you can use. One gives you just the full screen version. The other link gives you the editor version. And yeah. Okay. And then finally, we have the help menu over here. There's a few useful keyboard shortcuts. If you're the type of person who likes to use keyboard shortcuts, you can find them over here. And we have a link over there to the reference page. We're going to dive more into the reference page in the next video. So this is a good place to pause this lesson. I'll see you in the next one. We're going to take a step back, unpack all of this syntax one line at a time, and start introducing in a bit more depth these color functions and these shape drawing functions. All right, I'll see you there.